We'll begin with a major developing story tonight. That's according to the Kremlin, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine for the Orthodox Christmas, celebrated this week by both countries. This is the first time Russia has announced a full ceasefire in Ukraine since the launch of the offensive in February last year. Russian forces will put down their weapons from tomorrow at 9 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time until Saturday at 2100 hours Greenwich Mean Time. That's midday tomorrow until midnight the following day in Russia. The surprise move is coming after Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan pressed Putin to declare a unilateral ceasefire in Ukraine in a phone call earlier today. But a senior Ukrainian presidential advisor has tweeted that Russian troops must leave the occupied territories. Only then will it have a temporary truce. Okay, for more on this breaking news, let's join our chief correspondent, John Cookson, who is in the Vatican City covering the funeral of the former Pope Benedict XVI. Let's begin. Good evening and welcome, John. John, tell us what's the latest that you're hearing about this Christmas Day, Orthodox Christmas Day ceasefire in between Russia and Ukraine.
Hi, Christian. Good to see you. Well, there's some major developing stories, you say. Tonight, Putin making this surprise announcement to the world, although I have to say that in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been talking on this channel on Arise News about something like this being in the offing, a Christmas ceasefire. And I didn't mean the Christian Christmas period. I meant under the Julian calendar, which is Christmas Eve is tomorrow and Saturday. And it's come about. It has, I believe, been in the works for some time, although Putin just announced it today. He calls for the ceasefire, and the statement goes on to say, given the large number of citizens practicing orthodoxy reside in the area of hostilities, we call on the Ukrainian side to announce a ceasefire and give them an opportunity to attend services on Christmas Eve and the day of Christ's birth. Now, we've had no official word yet from Kyiv on this, although a senior advisor to President Zelensky, Mikhail Podolyak, says that it's a cynical ploy, that the Russians should pull out of occupied territories before there's any ceasefire. So it appears at least that the Ukrainians are being shunning this idea at the moment, but it's early in the evening still, and it may well be that the Ukrainians in the end agree to this ceasefire, which, heavens, for the poor people on the ground in the conflict zone, how welcome that would be. The Russians have called a ceasefire in the past. You recall last year when Mariupol was under siege, there was a brief lull in fighting to allow people to leave that beleaguered city, Ukrainians trapped there in their thousands, and also Ukrainian soldiers. So there is precedent for this. What I find interesting is that this statement came not only after the head of the Orthodox Church in Russia, Patriarch Kirill, called on Putin to announce a ceasefire. The announcement from the Kremlin came after Putin spoke to Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, earlier today. Those two are getting extremely close now, causing some, I think, concern in Washington and elsewhere of the closeness between Ankara and Moscow. Tayyip Erdogan becoming apparently a very close ally of Putin now, and ready to sell Putin's oil in breach of sanctions, but that's another story. So Erdogan apparently also urged Putin to call this ceasefire, according to the Turks. So on the face of it, announcing to the world, it was a surprise, perhaps not so really unexpected. And the big question now, Christian, is whether this ceasefire can last more than 36 hours.
Well, much more than that, just like, you stated in your submission that they've touted the issues of ceasefire. But with this present call, does the ceasefire mean peace talks are a possibility? Very quickly, John.
One can only hope. And if you look at conflicts throughout the world, they do come to an end eventually, even this one, the Russians fighting the Ukrainians. And it only happens after a ceasefire is called. You can only have talks. You can't have talks while people are fighting. So, in essence, there's a germ of an idea there. But the problem about peace in that part of the world is that both sides are so far apart. The Ukrainians, for example, they say they won't talk about peace unless there's a regime change in Moscow and Russian forces pull out of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And the Russians will never agree to that. And the Russians, in fact, saying tonight that they would consider peace talks, but only if the Ukrainians respect the territorial gains that the Russians have made already. So, unfortunately, as welcome as this ceasefire is, I can't see it leading to meaningful peace talks. At least not for now.
Okay. Do you then think? Or what do you think the reaction of the West, I mean the EU and the US will be to this news? Cherry?
Well, naturally, it has to be welcomed. I mean, any pause in fighting where so many people are dying on the ground, both civilians and soldiers, that has to be welcomed. And I'm sure the West, and here we're talking about Britain, the UK, Germany, and other major players in this, that they perhaps hoping that behind the scenes they can get some momentum going to persuade the Ukrainians to fall in with this ceasefire call, and also to even begin to talk about, officially that is, because I'm sure there are talks going on in the background in secret, officially to start at least beginning to talk about peace in the future, because such is the impact of this war in Europe. It's absolutely massive, boosting the cost of living and fueling recession in a number of countries. I mean, everybody wants this war to be over. So I'm sure the West, if they can see a chink of light there, they'll, on a diplomatic level, they'll try and pursue it.
I mean, that will really be gratifying. But John, don't go away, because we're still going to come back to you to update us with the funeral service of late Pope Benedict XVI. So you just stay with us. And to other stories, around 100,000 Catholics packed St. Peter's Square in Vatican City today for the funeral of the former Pope Benedict XVI. Benedict died on New Year's Eve, aged 95. Almost a decade after becoming the first pope in 600 years to resign. He now also becomes the first pontiff in the modern history of the Catholic Church to be buried by an incumbent pope. Arise News Chief Correspondent John Cookson was in St. Peter's Square for the ceremony.
They began arriving before dawn, thousands of the faithful from all over the world, wanting to be in St. Peter's Square to say a last farewell to Benedict. Security was high profile. Airspace above the Vatican was closed. Overnight, the late former Pope's remains, along with a parchment scroll listing his lifetime achievements and traditional coins, were placed in a coffin of cypress wood. Guests included Belgium's King and Queen, Italian Prime Minister Meloni and Italian President Mattarella. VIPs were few in number, as Benedict wasn't a sitting pope, and in any event he didn't want a fuss. Pope Francis, aged 86, looked frail as he struggles with a long-time knee complaint and was unable to stand for all of the Requiem Mass. Benedict was known for his towering intellect, but he was also a modest man, and today's simple ceremony was what he wanted, dignified, but without embellishment.
Pater Clementissime, Papam Emeritum Benedictum Committimus. In the homily, Pope Francis commended his predecessor into the hands of God the Father, citing Jesus' words on the cross. So how will history judge Benedict? As a theologian and teacher, his contribution to the Catholic Church is arguably unsurpassed. But his critics say his missteps, like not cracking down hard enough on paedophile priests, are an undeniable part of his legacy. Him meeting victims and saying sorry, a first by any pope, was simply not enough. So now Pope Francis must lead the faith through a turbulent time in world history, but without the support and intellect of Benedict in the background giving him advice. Some would argue the Catholic faith now faces a new and uncertain era. John Cookson, Arise News, Vatican City.
Okay, still staying with our chief correspondent there at the Vatican, John Cookson. He joins us again. John, you want to, you saw everything there at the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI, but the splendor and dignity of the Requiem Mass. Did he live up to his wishes?
I think so, Christian. Knowing as much as I do about the man that I picked up in the last few days, studying his background, I think it was probably pitch perfect. He was a towering intellect, a theologian of note, perhaps one of the greatest theologians in Catholic history. But he was also a modest man of simple means. He wasn't an extrovert. He was a shy man. He was bookish. Although he spoke 7 languages, he hated the trips around the world. He liked to be in the Vatican at the center of things, but from a theological point of view, rather than glad-handing parishioners all over the world. So to that extent, the Requiem Mass was just a simple. Okay, there was 100,000 people there, but for the Mass itself. It was very, very simple, just a regular Catholic Mass, a Requiem Mass, without the bells and the whistles. As I say, pitch perfect for that particular Pope. Of course, this is what he wanted. He said that he wanted this kind of send-off, and that's what the Vatican did. Tonight, I've seen images of his coffin, which that huge cypress wood coffin was taken into the St. Peter's Basilica and then sealed inside a zinc coffin. And then another wooden coffin made of maple wood surrounded that. And it was lowered into a grotto beneath St. Peter's Basilica, along with 65 other popes. Also in the coming days, ordinary members of the public will be allowed access to pay their respects. And in fact, the St. Peter's is no more than 500 meters to where I am at the moment, where the Pope has reached his final resting place. Christian.
Yes. John, what impact do you think Benedict's death will have on Pope Francis' remaining years in office? I think that's quite important too, because he's aging very fast, and we saw because of his knee problems, he had to be wheeled on a chair performing the ceremonies.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And as I mentioned earlier today, I was lucky enough to go with Pope Francis on a trip around Iraq only 2 years ago. And he wasn't skipping around like a 2-year-old then, but certainly he was agile. He didn't need a wheelchair. And it was, an exhausting and difficult trip for any person, let alone someone who was then 84. He's now 86. But I must say I was shocked when I saw images of him today coming out of St. Peter's in a wheelchair. We're not used to seeing the Pope in a wheelchair, and he's clearly suffering. He's always said that he would step down if he became too frail to carry on, and indeed it's Benedict's passing that has allowed that, because Benedict also resigned, setting a precedent that's never happened in 600 years. And so Pope Francis could follow Benedict's example, but in fact, Pope Francis has a trip booked. It's still on the cards to go to Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan later this month. From seeing him today, I can't see that happening. What other influences would the Benedict's death have? Well, as I said in my report, he was a constant advisor to Francis, and although there were other ends of the spectrum as far as the Catholic faith goes, Benedict very conservative, they were still very good friends, and they used to speak at least once a week by phone, and Francis always used to invite Benedict to important meetings of cardinals, so that eminence grise, that presence, that intellectual thought, that conservative mind has now gone, the influence has gone from Francis's world, and it will be interesting to see how he steers the Catholic faith through these turbulent times that we're living through at the moment. So he will be missed by Pope Francis hugely. What the future holds for the Catholic faith with a clearly ailing Pope, we'll have to wait and see.
Yes, we just have to wait and see, but he's really going to miss Pope Benedict XVI, just like the entire world will. Thanks so very much, John Cookson, Arise Chief Correspondent, live there from Rome.